I thought the lawyer had called me in to receive a keepsake. Maybe my grandfather's old watch. Maybe the little walnut music box he kept beside his hospital bed. Maybe one final letter, folded carefully in his steady handwriting, telling me not to let my family make me feel small anymore. I was ready for grief. I was ready for silence. I was not ready for the moment Caleb Monroe opened my grandfather's will, looked across the conference table, and said, "To my granddaughter, Grace Whitaker, I leave controlling ownership of Whitaker Senior Care Group, all associated trusts, real estate holdings, voting shares, and private assets, currently valued at approximately $6.8 billion. For 1 second, nobody breathed. Then my father stood so fast his chair slammed backward against the wall. "No," he said, staring at the lawyer like the word itself could rewrite the document. "Absolutely not." My mother's hand flew to her pearls. My brother Preston actually laughed, sharp and ugly, like this had to be some kind of joke. I sat there with my hands frozen in my lap, still wearing the black dress I'd bought on clearance for the funeral, still trying to understand how a hospice music therapist who could barely afford Boston rent had just inherited an empire built on hospitals, rehab centers, and nursing homes across New England. My father turned to me slowly. "Grace," he said, voice low, "you're going to sign the voting rights over to me before this goes any further." It wasn't a request. It was an order, the same kind of order I had obeyed my entire life. But then Caleb slid a sealed envelope toward me. My grandfather's name was written across it in blue ink. Arthur Whitaker, the only person in my family who had ever looked at me like I was more than a disappointment. I touched the envelope, and something inside me steadied. My father leaned closer. "Don't embarrass this family." I looked at him, then at my mother, then at my brother, and finally said the one word that turned grief into war. "No." 6 weeks earlier, my life had been so ordinary that most people would have forgotten it before lunch. Every weekday morning, I drove across Boston with a travel mug of coffee balanced between the seats of my aging Honda, praying the engine would survive one more winter. By 8 o'clock, I was inside Harbor Lights Hospice, greeting nurses who looked twice as tired as they admitted and patients who smiled anyway, because they understood something healthy people often didn't. Every ordinary day was still a gift. I wasn't a doctor or a billionaire's granddaughter in anyone's eyes. I was simply the music therapist who carried a worn leather bag filled with sheet music, tuning forks, and handwritten playlists created for people whose stories were almost over. Some mornings I played old jazz standards for veterans who could no longer remember their own birthdays, but somehow never forgot every lyric to songs they danced to in the 1950s. Other afternoons I sat beside patients who hadn't spoken in days until a familiar melody reached somewhere words no longer could. Those moments never made headlines. They didn't come with promotions or bonuses or impressive titles. But every time I watched someone squeeze a loved one's hand, because music had reached them one last time, I drove home believing I'd spent the day doing something that mattered. My parents never understood that. To them, success had always been measured in stock prices, executive titles, and invitations to charity galas, where everyone wore expensive smiles and talked about generosity over 5-course dinners. Whenever my mother introduced me to her friends, she never said I worked in hospice care. She always found a softer way to describe it. "Grace works with music," she'd say, before quickly changing the subject. My father was even worse. If someone asked about me during one of his business dinners, he'd usually laugh and tell them I was still figuring life out, as though spending my days comforting dying strangers was somehow less respectable than sitting in boardrooms discussing quarterly earnings. After enough years, I stopped trying to defend myself. It was easier to let them believe I lacked ambition than to explain that fulfillment and status weren't the same thing. The only person who never questioned my choices was Grandpa Arthur. Every Sunday afternoon, unless one of us was traveling, I'd drive out to his house overlooking the harbor. We'd drink tea in the sunroom while he asked about my patients by name, remembering details I'd forgotten he'd ever heard. "How's Mr. Kaplan?" he'd ask. "Did he ever finish telling you about flying helicopters in Vietnam?" Or he'd smile and ask whether Mrs. Donnelly was still insisting that Frank Sinatra had proposed to her in 1962. He listened to every story as though the people I cared for mattered just as much as the executives constantly asking him for meetings. Before I left, he'd always walk me to the front door with that same quiet smile and remind me of something he'd repeated since I was a teenager. Never judge your life by the size of the room people give you grace. Judge it by whether someone leaves feeling less alone after meeting you. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't simply giving advice. He was watching. Learning who I had become long after everyone else in my family had decided who they wanted me to be. While my father spent years preparing my brother Preston to someday control Whitaker's senior care group, Grandpa never once mentioned succession around me. We talked about books, patience, old jazz records, community gardens, and the handwritten letters he still mailed to residents celebrating their 100th birthdays. If business ever came up, he changed the subject before it lasted more than a few minutes. I honestly believed he wanted to protect our relationship from the company. I never imagined he was protecting something much bigger. The call came just after midnight on a rainy Tuesday. I had fallen asleep on my couch with patient reports spread across the coffee table when my phone vibrated across the wood hard enough to wake me. Unknown number, I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered with the kind of sleepy, "Hello?" that barely sounded like my own voice. The man on the other end introduced himself as a Massachusetts State Police officer. I remember every word he said after that, even though I wish I didn't. There had been an accident on Interstate 95. My grandfather's driver had survived with serious injuries. Grandpa hadn't. By the time the officer finished speaking, I realized I was still gripping the edge of the couch so tightly my fingertips had gone numb. I thanked him automatically, hung up, and sat there in complete silence. The apartment suddenly felt impossibly small. I kept expecting my phone to ring again with someone telling me there had been a mistake, that they'd misidentified the victim, that Grandpa was already asking why everyone was making such a fuss. The call never came. The funeral passed like a dream I couldn't wake up from. People filled the cathedral with polished shoes, tailored black suits, and carefully rehearsed condolences. Politicians praised Grandpa's philanthropy. Business leaders talked about his vision. Television cameras lingered outside, hoping to capture reactions from one of New England's wealthiest families. I barely noticed any of it. I stood near the front, listening to stories about the billionaire Arthur Whitaker, while remembering the man who carried peppermints in his pocket, because he knew I got carsick as a little girl. The man who once spent an entire afternoon helping me repair an old violin instead of buying me a new one because he believed fixing something taught you to value it. Somewhere behind me, I heard my father discussing board meetings before the service had even ended. Preston whispered to someone about upcoming investors. My mother worried that too many reporters had been allowed inside. I realized, standing only a few feet from Grandpa's casket, that I was grieving a person while everyone else seemed to be preparing for a transfer of power. 2 weeks later, Caleb Monroe called and asked our immediate family to gather at his office for the reading of the will. I assumed it would be a formality. Grandpa had already given generously to charities throughout his life. I figured the company would stay with my father, the board would approve the transition, and maybe I'd receive one of Grandpa's books or the old walnut music box that always sat beside his favorite reading chair. I remember smiling to myself at the thought, because that little music box had played the same lullaby since I was 5 years old. If you'd asked me that morning what I expected to inherit, I would have answered without hesitation. A memory, not a war. The morning of the will reading felt colder than it should have for early spring. Boston was wrapped in a gray sky that looked heavy enough to fall onto the city, and I remember sitting in my car outside Caleb Monroe's office for nearly 5 minutes, with both hands resting on the steering wheel. I wasn't nervous about money. I was nervous about hearing my grandfather's name spoken in the past tense again. Somehow, the funeral had never made his death feel real. Walking into the office that morning did. Caleb's office occupied the top floor of a restored brownstone overlooking Commonwealth Avenue. It didn't feel like the headquarters of a lawyer who represented billion-dollar clients. There were no marble floors or oversized chandeliers, just dark oak shelves lined with law books, framed photographs of old Boston neighborhoods, and a faint smell of coffee mixed with polished wood. Grandpa used to say Caleb chose offices that made people tell the truth instead of trying to impress each other. Looking around, I finally understood what he meant. Caleb met me in the reception area before anyone else arrived. He shook my hand with both of his and held it a second longer than necessary. "Your grandfather spoke about you often," he said quietly. "More than you probably realize." I managed a small smile. "He talked too much." Caleb smiled back. "No." He glanced toward the conference room before lowering his voice. He simply wanted to make sure someone remembered what kind of person he really was. Before I could respond, the elevator doors opened behind me. My father walked in first, wearing one of his custom navy suits as though he were heading to a shareholder meeting instead of a reading of his father's will. My mother followed close behind, perfectly composed, despite having buried her husband only 2 weeks earlier. Preston came last, carrying an expensive coffee and scrolling through his phone without bothering to look up. The first words out of his mouth weren't "good morning." They weren't "how are you holding up." They were, "let's make this quick. I've got investors waiting this afternoon." Caleb led us into the conference room without commenting. The long walnut table reflected the morning light pouring through tall windows overlooking the city. My father immediately took the chair at the head of the table without being asked. My mother sat beside him. Preston dropped into the chair across from me, kicked one ankle over his knee, and kept checking messages while Caleb organized several thick folders in front of him. I chose the seat closest to the window. I don't know why. Maybe I needed something outside that room to remind me the world was still moving. Caleb adjusted his glasses and opened the first folder. "Before we begin," he said, "Mr. Arthur Whitaker updated his estate plan approximately 11 months ago. The revisions were completed over several meetings, witnessed, medically certified, and reviewed independently. There is no legal question regarding his capacity or intent." My father waved his hand impatiently. "That's standard language, Caleb. Just read the will." Caleb looked at him for a brief moment before nodding. "Very well," he began reading. Most of the opening pages were exactly what I'd expected. Charitable donations, endowments for medical research, funding for employee education programs, long-term care, trusts for retired staff members. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. Even after his death, he was still making sure people were taken care of. Then Caleb paused, turned another page, and looked directly at me. "To my granddaughter, Grace Whitaker." I lifted my eyes. "I leave controlling ownership of Whitaker Senior Care Group, all associated trusts, voting shares, real estate holdings, and private assets, currently valued at approximately $6.8 billion. For a heartbeat, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood him. 6.8 billion? I stared at Caleb, waiting for him to correct himself. He didn't. Instead, I heard my father's chair crash against the hardwood floor. "This is impossible." His voice echoed through the room so violently that even Preston finally looked up from his phone. "No," my father said again, pointing toward the documents. "Read it correctly." I just did. "You skipped something." I didn't. "The company comes to me." Caleb calmly turned the will toward him. "It does not." My mother grabbed the edge of the table as though the room had started spinning. "Grace?" She looked at me with complete disbelief. "She works in hospice." Nobody answered. Preston laughed once, a sharp, humorless laugh. "This has to be temporary." He leaned toward Caleb. "Where's the part about the family trust?" "You're looking at it." "What about Dad?" "What about me?" my father demanded. Caleb folded his hands. "Mr. Whitaker's will provides individual financial trusts for each of you." My father frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means your father made provisions for your personal financial security. And the company. The company belongs to Grace." Silence, not ordinary silence. The kind that exists just before something breaks. My father slowly turned toward me. "You knew." I blinked. "What?" "You knew." "I didn't. Don't lie to me." "I'm not." "You expect me to believe he handed $6.8 billion to a music therapist without telling her?" I had no idea. For the first time since walking into the room, Caleb interrupted. "She's telling the truth." My father ignored him completely. "You spent years manipulating him." "No. You filled his head with stories." "I visited my grandfather." "You isolated him." "I loved him." That was the sentence that finally made everyone stop talking. I loved him. Not his company, not his money, just him. Caleb quietly reached into another folder and removed a sealed envelope bearing my grandfather's signature. He anticipated this conversation. My father stared at the envelope. "What is that?" "A personal statement." Caleb placed it in front of me. He instructed me to give this to Grace only after the will had been read. I ran my fingers across Grandpa's familiar handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Across the table, my father spoke again. His voice had changed. The anger was still there, but beneath it was calculation. "Grace," I looked up. "We're going home." It wasn't an invitation. It sounded like the beginning of a negotiation, one my father had already decided I couldn't refuse. The drive to my parents' house took less than 30 minutes, but it felt much longer. My father's message had arrived before I'd even left Caleb's office. "Be here at 6. We're settling this as a family." There wasn't a single question in the text. No please. No, can we talk? Just another command, written with the same certainty he'd used my entire life whenever he expected obedience. I told myself maybe grief had finally caught up with him. Maybe once the shock wore off, we'd actually talk about Grandpa instead of the company. Deep down, though, I already knew better. The house looked exactly the way it always had. Perfect landscaping, fresh flowers beside the front steps. Every window glowing warmly as if we were about to celebrate a holiday instead of tear each other apart. Growing up, I used to think this house represented stability. The older I got, the more I realized it represented appearances. Everything had to look successful from the outside, even if nobody inside remembered how to love each other. I stood on the porch for a few seconds before ringing the bell, wondering why I still felt like a child asking permission to come home. My mother opened the door almost immediately. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was eating or sleeping, or whether I was holding up after losing the man who had practically raised me. She simply stepped aside and said, "They're waiting." Her voice was flat, efficient, almost rehearsed. The living room had been arranged like a corporate meeting instead of a family conversation. My father stood beside the fireplace with a crystal glass of bourbon in his hand. Preston was sitting on the sofa with his laptop open, typing something without looking at me. No one mentioned Grandpa, not once. "Sit down," my father said. I did. Part of me hated that I still listened automatically. He waited until I was settled before placing a leather folder on the coffee table between us. "This doesn't have to become ugly." I looked at the folder. "What is it?" "Transfer documents." I frowned. "For what?" He stared at me as though the answer should have been obvious. "The voting rights." I looked back up. "You want me to sign them over?" "I need you to." The correction caught my attention. Not want. Need. "Why?" My father exhaled slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "Because your grandfather made an emotional decision." I almost laughed. "You think Grandpa made emotional business decisions?" "He made one." "No. He left a healthcare empire to someone with no executive experience." "I've never asked to run it." "Exactly." He leaned forward, "Which is why you'll transfer control to me." My mother finally joined the conversation. "You'll still be wealthy, Grace." She smiled in the same practiced way she used during charity galas. "You'll have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. "How much?" She blinked. "What?" "How much are you offering me?" My father answered immediately. 10%. I stared at him. 10%. That's $680 million. He actually sounded generous. As if I should be grateful. "It is generous." Preston finally closed his laptop. "Honestly, Grace, you'd never even notice the difference." He shrugged. "You'll still be one of the richest women in America." "And you?" He smiled. "I'll finally have enough capital to scale my company." There it was. Not concern, not family, not responsibility, just money. Always money. I looked around the room and suddenly realized every person sitting there was already spending an inheritance that wasn't theirs. I folded my hands together to stop myself from shaking. "Did either of you ever ask Grandpa why he made this decision?" Nobody answered. "Did you ever wonder if he wanted something more than another CEO?" Still nothing. My father sighed impatiently. "This isn't about feelings." "No? No. It's about protecting the Whitaker name." I couldn't stop myself. The Whitaker name was never in danger. His jaw tightened. "It is now." "Because of me." "Because you're inexperienced." "I'm inexperienced at running corporations." Exactly. I'm not inexperienced at taking care of people. He dismissed the sentence with a wave of his hand. That isn't leadership. I felt something inside me finally settle. For years I'd tried to earn his approval, a better degree, a better job, a better salary. Nothing had ever been enough, because the standard kept changing. For the first time, I understood why. He had never wanted me to become myself. He had wanted me to become useful to him. My mother reached across the table and gently pushed the folder toward me. Sweetheart, her voice softened. You don't have to carry this burden. I looked at her. It doesn't feel like you're trying to protect me. Her smile disappeared. It feels like you're trying to protect yourselves. The room went completely still. My father's patience vanished. Enough, he stood. I'm done pretending this is optional. He walked around the coffee table until he was standing directly in front of me. Sign the documents. No. His expression didn't change. I don't think you heard me. I did. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand exactly what's at stake. It's your family. I shook my head. No. It's Grandpa's legacy. For the first time that evening, anger gave way to something darker. My father's voice dropped almost to a whisper. If you walk out of this house without signing those papers, he paused. Don't come back. I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to apologize for something I hadn't even done. Then I remembered the sealed envelope still sitting in my purse. Grandpa's handwriting, his faith in me, the way he'd always smiled whenever I doubted myself. I slowly stood. I lost the only person who truly believed in me 2 weeks ago. My voice was shaking now. But I won't lose his trust tonight. I picked up my purse. I'm not signing. My mother's chair scraped loudly against the floor. You walk out that door. She pointed toward the entryway. And you're no longer part of this family. I looked at both of them for a long moment. Then I answered with the calmest voice I'd used all day. I don't think I stopped being part of this family tonight. I swallowed hard. I think it happened years ago. No one tried to stop me as I walked toward the front door. No one called my name. No one apologized. Behind me, I heard my father say only one sentence. If you leave with that company, you leave with nothing else. I opened the door. The cold evening air hit my face. I stepped outside carrying only my purse, my overnight bag, and the sealed envelope my grandfather had trusted me to open only after everything else had fallen apart. I didn't drive back to my apartment. Without really thinking about it, I found myself heading north along the coastline toward my grandfather's estate. The roads were almost empty, and the farther I got from the city, the quieter everything became. My phone buzzed over and over again in the cup holder. My father, my mother, Preston. Then numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer a single call. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to explain myself. There was nothing left to explain. The wrought iron gates appeared through the evening fog just as they always had. Except this time, they didn't feel like the entrance to my grandfather's home. They felt like the last place in the world where I still belonged. I rolled down my window and reached into my purse for the old brass key Grandpa had handed me the previous Christmas. I remembered laughing when he'd insisted I keep it. You never know when you'll need your own way in, he'd said, with that familiar smile. I teased him for being dramatic. Standing there now, my hands trembling around that same key, I realized he hadn't been joking at all. The gates opened slowly. As I drove up the winding driveway, every memory seemed to arrive at once. Learning to ride a bicycle beneath the maple trees, helping Grandpa plant tulips every spring because he claimed flowers were just another way of welcoming people home, sitting beside him on the back porch while he explained why every nursing home in his company had to serve real home-cooked meals at least twice a week. People don't stop needing dignity because they grow old, he'd told me. If we ever forget that, we don't deserve to care for them. I parked in front of the house and sat there for nearly a minute before getting out. The porch light was already on. That surprised me. I was certain no one was supposed to be here. Before I could reach the front door, it opened. A tall man in his 60s stepped onto the porch wearing a navy cardigan instead of the formal suit I'd always seen him in. Miss Grace? My throat tightened. Thomas. Thomas Reed smiled, though his eyes were still red from crying. I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come tonight. I walked up the steps and hugged him before I could stop myself. He'd worked beside my grandfather for almost 30 years. officially as a state director, unofficially as the person who somehow managed to solve every problem before anyone else even noticed one existed. I thought everyone would have left. Thomas gently shook his head. Your grandfather made sure that wouldn't happen. He stepped aside. Come inside. The house smelled exactly the way I remembered. Cedarwood, fresh coffee, the faint scent of old books that had lived on the same shelves for decades. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Thomas led me into Grandpa's library, where a fire was already burning in the stone fireplace. My overnight bag was still sitting by the door when he disappeared briefly into another room before returning with a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. It was made from dark walnut, polished smooth with age. He asked me to give you this. I looked at the brass latch. Tonight? Thomas nodded. But only after you refused. I frowned. Refused what? He looked at me carefully. To surrender the company. A chill ran through me. He knew they'd ask. He didn't know. Thomas smiled sadly. He expected. I slowly opened the box. Inside wasn't cash. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't legal paperwork. Resting on a folded piece of navy velvet sat the small walnut music box I'd loved since childhood. I lifted it carefully into my hands. The tiny brass key was still tucked into the side. Without thinking, I wound it once. A soft melody drifted through the library, the same lullaby Grandpa used to play whenever frightened patients visited one of his hospice centers. I closed my eyes. For a moment, it felt like he was still in the room. Beneath the music box lay a sealed envelope. My name appeared across the front in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. Not Grace Whitaker. Just my Grace. My vision blurred before I'd even broken the seal. Thomas quietly stepped toward the doorway. I'll leave you alone. No, I looked up. Please stay. He hesitated before sitting across from me. I opened the envelope. The first line stole the air from my lungs. Grace, if you're reading this from my library instead of your apartment, then your family has already asked you to give away something that was never theirs to claim. I looked at Thomas. He knew. Thomas nodded once. He knew exactly who they had become. I continued reading. If Martin demands control, it isn't because he doubts your ability. It's because he needs it. I stopped. What does that mean? Thomas's expression became serious. Keep reading. My hands shook. There are things about this company your father desperately hopes you'll never discover. Don't make any decisions until Caleb arrives tomorrow morning. Trust him. Trust Thomas. And above all, trust yourself. The letter ended there. No explanation. No details. Only Grandpa's signature. I looked back at Thomas. What is he talking about? Instead of answering immediately, Thomas walked toward one of the built-in bookshelves and pressed gently against a carved wooden panel. A hidden compartment slid open. Inside sat 6 thick binders labeled only with dates. What are those? Thomas looked directly at me. For nearly a year before he died, your grandfather quietly investigated the executive leadership of Whitaker Senior Care Group. I felt my pulse quicken. My father? Thomas nodded. And he didn't like what he found. Before I could ask another question, headlights swept across the front windows. Both of us turned instinctively toward the driveway. A black SUV had just stopped outside the house. Thomas walked to the window and looked through the curtains. His expression hardened. They're here. Who? He looked back at me. Your parents. Then he added one sentence that told me this night was far from over. And they didn't come alone. I set the letter down so quickly it almost slipped from my hands. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could hear it over the music box still playing its quiet melody on the coffee table. Thomas didn't panic. If anything, he seemed to have been expecting this moment for a long time. He calmly closed the hidden compartment in the bookshelf before looking at me. Whatever happens, he said, don't argue with them at the door. I frowned. Why? He gave me a small, reassuring smile. Because your grandfather never relied on arguments when he could rely on evidence. A second later, the doorbell rang. Not once. 3 sharp presses in rapid succession. Then someone pounded on the front door. Grace, my father's voice echoed through the foyer. I know you're in there. I instinctively stood, but Thomas gently raised one hand. Stay here. He walked toward the front entrance with the calm confidence of someone who had protected this house for decades. I followed a few steps behind despite his instructions. stopping where the hallway opened into the foyer. From there, I could see everything without being seen immediately. Thomas unlocked the front door but kept one hand on it. "Good evening, Mr. Whitaker." My father didn't bother returning the greeting. "Move. I'm afraid I can't do that. This is my father's house." Thomas shook his head politely. "It belonged to your father." He paused. "It now belongs to Miss Whitaker." My father's jaw tightened. "You work for this family." "I do." "Then step aside." "I work for the owner." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother stepped forward. Her tone was completely different from my father's. Soft, gentle, almost pleading. "Grace?" She looked past Thomas until our eyes met. "Can we please talk?" I hesitated. Thomas glanced back at me. The decision was mine. I slowly walked into the foyer. "What do you want?" My mother took a step toward me. "I don't want us to end the day like this." "No? No. We're still family," I almost smiled. It amazed me how quickly the word family appeared whenever $6.8 billion entered the conversation. My father reached into his briefcase and removed another folder. "I've made some changes." "I didn't ask you to." "You'll want to hear them." "I don't." His patience disappeared. "You don't understand how businesses work." "No. I understand exactly how trust works." His face hardened. "I've increased your share." "I don't want a share." "You'll keep 20%. I stared at him. "So now my loyalty is worth another 10%? My mother flinched. "Grace." "No." I looked directly at my father. "You aren't negotiating. You're bidding." Preston finally stepped out from behind them. He hadn't spoken until now. "You really think Grandpa believed you could run this company?" I met his eyes. "I think Grandpa believed what he wrote." He laughed. "No. He pitied you." The sentence stung. Not because I believed it, because I knew exactly how long my brother had believed it himself. "You've always needed someone to rescue you." He folded his arms. "First Grandpa. Now his employees. What happens when they stop protecting you?" Before I could answer, another voice came from behind me. "They won't." Caleb Monroe walked into the foyer carrying a slim leather briefcase. I hadn't even heard his car arrive. He nodded politely toward everyone before looking at my father. "I thought I might find you here." My father looked irritated. "What are you doing?" "Following your father's instructions." Caleb removed a sealed document from his briefcase. "Mr. Whitaker requested that this be delivered only if anyone attempted to pressure Grace into surrendering control before the board's emergency meeting." My father laughed bitterly. "More letters." "No." Caleb placed the document on the entry table. "A temporary governance order." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Caleb looked toward me. "It means that effective immediately, no executive, including your father, may authorize the sale of company assets, transfer voting rights, refinance corporate debt, or negotiate acquisition offers without your written approval." I blinked. "What acquisition offers?" Silence. I looked at my father. His expression changed for only a second, but it was enough. I turned back to Caleb. "There are acquisition offers?" He nodded slowly. "There have been for months." My stomach tightened. "You mean before Grandpa died?" "Yes." I looked at my father again. "You were planning to sell the company?" "No. I was exploring options." "To whom?" He didn't answer. Caleb quietly opened another folder. "The board requested an independent valuation after your grandfather became concerned." He handed me the first page. Across the top was the name of one of the largest private equity firms in the country. I recognized it immediately. They had been in the news for buying struggling healthcare companies, cutting staff, closing facilities, and selling valuable real estate for profit. I looked up slowly. "They wanted Whitaker Senior Care." Caleb nodded. "And your father was negotiating." I felt sick. Grandpa hadn't spent his life building places where elderly people could live with dignity, just so someone could turn them into numbers on a spreadsheet. My father stepped forward. "You don't understand corporate finance." "No." I shook my head. "I understand what happens when nursing homes lose nurses. I understand what happens when rehabilitation centers cut therapists. I understand what happens when patients become expenses instead of people." For the first time since we'd arrived, my father looked genuinely angry. "You've spent your life working inside one hospice." "I've spent mine building an empire," I answered before he could continue. Grandpa built the empire. You were trying to sell it. The silence that followed felt heavier than every argument we'd had all evening. Finally, Caleb spoke again. The emergency board meeting begins tomorrow morning at 9. He looked directly at me. Your grandfather left one final recording. My pulse quickened. A recording? Yes. He instructed the board to watch it only after his death. Caleb paused. And only if someone attempted to take control away from you. I looked at the sealed envelope still resting on the table beside the music box. Everything Grandpa had prepared wasn't about giving me billions. It was about making sure I understood exactly why he'd trusted me. Then Caleb said the one sentence that made me realize tomorrow would change far more than my future. He didn't just leave you the company, Grace. He left you the truth about the people who wanted it most. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my grandfather's voice repeating the same sentence he'd told me dozens of times growing up. People are never your greatest investment, Grace. They're your greatest responsibility. At the time, I thought he was talking about kindness. Now I understood he had been talking about leadership. By 8:30 the next morning, I was sitting in the executive boardroom of Whitaker's Senior Care Group for the first time in my life. The room overlooked Boston Harbor, its floor-to-ceiling windows flooding the polished walnut table with pale morning light. Around me sat men and women who had worked beside my grandfather for decades. Some had known him longer than I'd been alive. They weren't looking at me with skepticism the way I'd expected. They looked relieved, as though they'd been waiting for this meeting almost as long as my grandfather had. My father arrived 5 minutes late. He walked in with my mother and Preston behind him, dressed exactly as if he were about to announce himself as the company's next chairman. The confidence on his face lasted only until he noticed the additional chairs occupied by outside legal counsel, independent auditors, and 2 members of the company's ethics committee. He looked toward Caleb immediately. What is this? Caleb calmly closed the conference room doors. Your father's final board instructions. Everyone took their seats. No one spoke. Caleb placed a small black flash drive in the center of the table. This recording was created 38 days before Mr. Whitaker's death, he said. Per his written instructions, it was to remain sealed unless anyone attempted to pressure Grace Whitaker into surrendering executive control. My father's jaw tightened. This is unnecessary. Caleb looked at him without flinching. No, it became necessary yesterday. He connected the drive. The large screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Then I saw him. Grandpa. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner too, but his eyes were exactly the same, steady, warm, impossible to intimidate. He smiled gently into the camera. If you're watching this, then I'm no longer here to settle the disagreement myself. I hoped this recording would never be necessary, but hope is not a business strategy. A few board members smiled sadly. Martin, Grandpa continued, if you're sitting in this room today because you're trying to convince Grace to surrender the company, then you've already proven why I couldn't leave it to you. Nobody moved, not even Preston. For the last 11 months, I quietly commissioned independent reviews of our executive leadership. I did not investigate because I stopped loving my son. I investigated because I stopped recognizing his decisions. The screen changed. Audit reports, board evaluations, acquisition proposals, private equity offers, projected layoffs, facility closures, hospice programs marked for elimination because they generated insufficient returns. I felt my stomach turn. Grandpa looked directly into the camera. Healthcare is not a collection of buildings. It's a promise. The day patients become numbers on a spreadsheet. The company has already forgotten why it exists. The room remained silent. Then Grandpa said something I never expected to hear. Grace doesn't know this, but 3 years ago she unknowingly reported one of our own nursing facilities after witnessing residents receive inadequate care. My head lifted. I remembered. One of my hospice patients had been transferred there for rehabilitation. The staffing shortage had been obvious. Medication had been delayed. Families were frustrated. I'd filed a formal complaint because I couldn't walk away pretending everything was fine. I never knew the facility belonged to Whitaker Senior Care. Grandpa smiled. She never mentioned my name. She never asked for special treatment. She simply protected people who couldn't protect themselves. He paused. That was the moment I knew. It wasn't her compassion alone that convinced me. It was her integrity. She chose to do the right thing when she believed nobody important was watching. My eyes filled with tears. For years, I'd believed Grandpa left me everything because he loved me more than the rest of the family. I finally understood how wrong I'd been. He didn't choose me because I was his favorite. He chose me because he believed I would protect the people he had spent his entire life serving. The recording continued. Martin, if your ambition had only affected your own future, I would have accepted your mistakes. But the moment profit became more important than patient care, you stopped protecting the mission your mother and I spent 50 years building. The final document appeared on the screen, a signed board resolution, effective immediately upon Arthur Whitaker's death. Martin Whitaker's authority to negotiate any merger, acquisition, or sale of Whitaker's Senior Care Group would automatically expire. Every signature had already been collected. Every legal requirement had already been completed. Grandpa had thought of everything. He looked into the camera one last time. Leadership isn't inherited. It's recognized. The screen faded to black. The silence afterward felt endless. Finally, the chairman of the independent board cleared his throat. Mr. Martin Whitaker, this board unanimously accepts Arthur Whitaker's succession plan. He slid a formal resolution across the table. Effective immediately, your role as interim chief executive is terminated. My father didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment. Only the painful realization that the position he'd spent years believing was already his had quietly disappeared long before Grandpa ever passed away. You really think you can carry all of this? He asked. I looked around the room, at Caleb, at Thomas, at the board members who had devoted decades to this company. Then I looked back at him. No, I answered honestly. I think we can. Several months passed. The board appointed an experienced healthcare executive as CEO, while I accepted the role of chair of the Whitaker Family Trust, focusing on ethics, patient advocacy, employee welfare, and long-term planning. Together, we restored staffing levels across multiple facilities, expanded hospice support programs, increased caregiver training, and invested in the people who had spent years quietly caring for others. Quarterly profits didn't rise as quickly as some investors wanted, but patient satisfaction did. Employee retention did. Families once again trusted the name Whitaker. And somehow, I think Grandpa would have considered that the better measure of success. On the first anniversary of his passing, I returned alone to the garden behind his estate. The tulips we planted together had bloomed again, just as they did every spring. I placed a bouquet of white lilies beside the memorial bench, where he used to drink tea in the afternoons, then took the old walnut music box from my bag. I wound the tiny brass key, and the familiar melody drifted through the quiet garden. Closing my eyes, I could almost hear him laughing beside me. As I walked back toward the house, I realized something my grandfather had been teaching me all along. Real wealth isn't measured by what's written on a balance sheet. It's measured by the number of lives that become safer because you chose integrity over convenience. For years, I believed my greatest dream was to make my family proud. Instead, I discovered something far more important. Sometimes the people who refuse to see your worth are the very people least qualified to define it. You don't have to earn love by surrendering your boundaries. You don't have to trade your values just to keep other people comfortable. And you should never mistake someone's entitlement for your responsibility. Every time I look at that old walnut music box sitting on the bookshelf in my office, I remember the question Grandpa spent his entire life teaching me to ask. Who benefits from the choice you're about to make? If the answer is only yourself, it's probably the wrong choice. People often ask me what it feels like to inherit nearly $7 billion. They're always surprised by my answer. Because the money was never the hardest part. The hardest part was becoming worthy of the trust that came with it. My grandfather didn't leave me an empire because I was family. He left it to me because long before anyone imagined I'd inherit one, I had already chosen people over power. And in the end, that became the only inheritance that truly mattered. If you've stayed with me until the end of my story, thank you. Now I'd love to hear what you think. If you had been in my place, would you have signed those papers to keep your family together? Or would you have protected your grandfather's final wish, even if it meant walking away from the people you loved most? Share your answer in the comments. I read as many of them as I can because every perspective teaches us something. And if stories about family betrayal, difficult choices, unexpected justice, and the power of integrity resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting for you. Until next time, take care of the people who earn your trust, and never let anyone convince you that love should cost your integrity.